The clock struck midnight. A single gunshot echoed through the empty corridors of the Grand Windsor Hotel. The city outside hummed with life, oblivious to the secret that had just been buried beneath layers of deception. In room 713, a man lay motionless, a trickle of blood staining the white marble floor, yet there was no gun in sight, no forced entry, no sign of struggle, just a cryptic note on the bedside table, written in a language no one could understand, and then just like that, the body vanished. I stood by the rain-speckled window of our dimly lit apartment, my gaze idly drifting over the bustling street below. Then something peculiar caught my attention. "Now this is interesting," I murmured under my breath. Poirot nestled comfortably in his armchair, barely glanced up. "And what, mon ami, has stirred your ever-curious mind?" Observe Poirot, a woman elegantly dressed, dark velvet coat, pearls glinting at her throat, a feathered hat, tilted just so. She moves cautiously, pausing now and then, as if checking for something, or someone. But what truly intrigues me is the small group trailing her. Two men, one tall and wiry, the other shorter, broad-shouldered, a woman in a drab grey coat, her head always slightly turned towards the lady, and just now, an urchin barely 10, has run up to them, pointing frantically at her while speaking in hurried whispers. What do you make of it? Is she a jewel thief on the verge of being captured, or an unsuspecting prey, moments away from a sinister trap? Poirot gave a quiet chuckle, and with his usual deliberation, rose to join me at the window. He studied the scene below, his sharp eyes glinting with amusement. Then he turned to me with a small knowing smile. "Ah, Hastings, ever the dramatist, you weave tales where none exist. That, mon ami, is Lady Evelyn Harcourt, the American heiress, and those men, private agents hired for her protection. The woman in grey, a scandal-hungry journalist, hoping for a story, and the boy, merely a street runner paid to confirm her arrival." I blinked. "You're certain?" "As always," he said smugly, "and unlike you, I require no grand theories, only the simple art of observation. You see, the brooch on her lapel is no ordinary trinket. It is the infamous sapphire tear, stolen once before, and as fate would have it, she now parades it through the streets of London, oblivious to the shadows she attracts. But tell me, Hastings, if I have deduced all this from a single glance, do you not wonder what greater mysteries await?" I swallowed, glancing back at the scene below, where the shadows of London's secrets stretched ever longer. "But take heart, mon ami," Poirot said with an air of mock sympathy. "Not everyone can be Hercule Poirot, such is life." "You really do have the highest opinion of yourself," I remarked, torn between exasperation and amusement. "What else can one do when one is, how do you say, without equal? And I am not alone in this belief. If I am not mistaken, we shall soon have a visitor who shares it." "A visitor? Who?" Poirot steepled his fingers and smirked. "Observe the nature of this street, Hastings. It is not one where the aristocracy reside. There are no renowned doctors here, no sought-after tailors, and certainly no milliners of high repute. But there is, mon ami, a detective of great fame." He tapped his chest. "One who has become the talk of London's elite. Lost your emerald ring, they whisper. Go to the little Belgian. He is marvelous, too extraordinary. Run." And so they come, fools and fortune-seekers alike. As if on cue, the doorbell rang below. Poirot's eyes twinkled. "And now the proof of my words. That, I wager, is none other than Lady Evelyn Carlisle." "Lady Evelyn," I repeated, startled. "The widow of Lord Carlisle, the very same, a woman of striking beauty, newly arrived from New York, and the owner of one of the rarest jewels in existence, the infamous Midnight Star." Even as he spoke, the heavy footsteps of the landlady sounded on the stairs, and moments later, the door swung open. There, standing in the doorway, was Lady Evelyn herself, her gloved hands clutching at the folds of her exquisite sable coat, her violet eyes wide with something between fear and determination. Poirot bowed slightly. "Lady Evelyn, welcome. I assume you are here because of the Midnight Star." She hesitated for the briefest of moments before nodding. "Monsieur Poirot, it's gone." A hush fell over the room. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Tell me everything," he said simply. Their arrival in London had caused a sensation. Every society column buzzed with admiration for Lady Evelyn Carlisle, her beauty, her poise, her fashion, but most of all, for the legendary jewel she carried, the fabled midnight star, a diamond of unparalleled brilliance, whispered to be worth more than £50,000. It was the kind of treasure that inspired myths, envy, and perhaps crime. As these thoughts flitted through my mind, I joined Poirot in welcoming our visitor. Lady Evelyn was a vision of elegance, but beneath her composed exterior, there was something else, a flicker of unease. Poirot, ever the gentleman, offered her a chair, and the moment she settled, words tumbled from her lips. "Monsieur Poirot, I fear I may be acting foolishly, but I could not ignore what I have received. Lord Ashford was just telling me last night how you solved the mystery of his brother's disappearance, and I knew I had to come to you. My husband dismisses it as nonsense, but these letters, they haunt me." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "Letters, madame, you have my full attention." With trembling fingers, she reached into her handbag and withdrew 3 envelopes, which she handed to him. He examined them carefully, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Plain paper, no watermark, the name and address printed with deliberate precision. "And now let us see what has so disturbed you." I moved closer, as he unfolded the first letter. The message, printed in an eerily neat hand, was brief. "The jewel that burns like the midnight sun must return to its rightful place." Poirot opened the second, the same words, but the third letter was different, more chilling. "You have been warned, you have not obeyed. The time of reckoning is near." A silence settled over the room. The ticking of the clock seemed louder, the air heavier. Poirot turned the letters over in his hands, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "Tell me, madame," he said, his voice soft yet firm, "do you believe in curses?" Lady Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. Her gloved hands clenched tightly together. Somewhere in the streets of London, the shadows stretched longer, and we had just taken our first step into a mystery that would change everything. "The diamond will be taken from you. At the full moon the twin jewels left and right shall return to their rightful place. So it is written." Poirot read the final words aloud, his voice calm but his expression sharp with thought. Lady Evelyn sat rigid in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of her handbag as if it alone could anchor her to reality. "The first letter I dismissed," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "A childish prank, I thought. The second made me uneasy, and when the third arrived yesterday, I could no longer ignore it." Poirot turned the letters over in his hands, scrutinizing every detail. "These were not sent by post." "No," she confirmed. "They were delivered by hand, by a Chinaman." There was a silence. Poirot's brows lifted, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "And this alarms you, madame, because the diamond came from a man just like him," she whispered. 3 years ago, in San Francisco, my husband Gregory bought it from a Chinese dealer. He never spoke a word about its origins, just thrust the jewel into Gregory's hands as though it burned him. He was in a hurry to be rid of it, terrified. She hesitated before adding, "He sold it for a fraction of what it was worth. Gregory gave it to me as a wedding gift." Poirot's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of his chair. "A fascinating tale," he muttered. "One woven with the threads of both romance and menace." He turned to me suddenly. "Hastings, my almanac." I retrieved the small book, and Poirot flipped through the pages with deft precision. "The full moon," he mused. "Ah, Friday next. That is in 3 days' time." Lady Evelyn paled. 3 days. Poirot met her gaze with unwavering intensity. "Madame, you came seeking my advice. I shall give it to you. But heed my words carefully, for I fear this is no mere superstition." A heavy silence fell over the room, the weight of an unspoken danger pressing in from the shadows. Outside, the streets of London bustled as always, oblivious to the fact that somewhere, someone had already decided the fate of the midnight star, and that the game had only just begun. This tale may be mere superstition, or it may be something far more dangerous. Poirot mused, his keen eyes never leaving Lady Evelyn's face. "Which is why, madame, I advise you to entrust the diamond to my care, at least until the full moon has passed. Then, and only then, can we decide the next course of action." A shadow flickered across Lady Evelyn's delicate features. She hesitated, then forced a smile. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Poirot leaned forward. Then perhaps you have it with you. There was a pause, just long enough to be telling. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached into the folds of her gown. A thin silver chain emerged, glinting under the soft glow of the gaslight. Dangling from it, cradled in the curve of her palm, was a diamond, large, mesmerizing, alive with a cold white fire. Poirot let out a sharp breath, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to seize it. Magnifique, he murmured. You permit, madame. She hesitated only a second before placing it in his waiting hands. He examined it with a jeweler's eye, tilting it under the light, watching how it caught and refracted every shimmer, every flicker. His lips pressed together, his mind already racing down corridors of deduction. After a moment, he returned it to her with a slight bow. A flawless stone, he said. And yet you carry it about so carelessly? Lady Evelyn laughed, but the sound rang hollow. Not carelessly, Monsieur Poirot. Usually it remains locked in my jewel case, safe within the vault at our hotel. I only brought it today because, well, I thought you should see it. Then you will leave it with me, n'est-ce pas? Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. Papa Poirot gives good advice. The hesitation returned. A battle waged behind her sapphire blue eyes. Then, with a delicate sigh, she shook her head. That would be difficult, you see. On Friday, Gregory and I will be traveling to Blackwood Manor for a weekend with Lord and Lady Redgrave. The name struck a distant chord in my memory, though I could not at once recall why. But Poirot, ever observant, did not press. Instead, he merely folded his hands and studied her with an intensity that made the air in the room seem to tighten. Then I suppose, he said at last, we must ensure that you live to see the end of this tale, madame. A silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the edges of our awareness. Outside, the city hummed on, oblivious to the fact that somewhere in its depths, the next move had already been made, and the game was no longer in her hands. A flicker of recognition stirred in the recesses of my mind. Yardley Chase, Lord and Lady Redgrave, and something else. Some scandal whispered in exclusive circles. Yes, I remembered now. A few years back, during a lavish visit to California, Lord Redgrave had become quite the notorious figure, his name linked with several high-profile indulgences. But the more tantalizing gossip hadn't been about him, it had been about Lady Redgrave. Her name had been whispered alongside that of a rising American film star, and not just any star, Gregory B. Rolfe. Miss Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping in pitch. I'll let you in on a little secret, Monsieur Poirot, she said, eyes gleaming with an intrigue that set my nerves on edge. We've been in talks with Lord Redgrave. There's a very real chance we might be filming at Blackwood Manor. Can you imagine? That grand old estate captured on screen. The history, the mystery, it's perfect. Blackwood Manor, I exclaimed, genuinely intrigued. Why, it's one of the most revered estates in England, she nodded. It's as grand as they say, ancient halls, secret passageways, enough history to fill a library. But of course Lord Redgrave won't part with his home so easily. He's asking a steep price. Greg and I, however, have a rule. Whenever we can, we mix business with pleasure. Poirot, who had been watching her keenly, now spoke with quiet deliberation. A fascinating prospect, madame. But pardon me if I appear dense. Surely you could visit Blackwood Manor without taking the diamond along. Something changed in Miss Evelyn then. The soft girlish innocence that adorned her like a well-worn mask faltered, revealing for just a second the sharp, calculating gleam in her eyes. A predator's awareness, a flicker of something unspoken. She smiled, not warmly, not nervously, just deliberately. My dear Monsieur Poirot, she murmured, some things are more complicated than they appear. A chill ran down my spine. There was more to this than she was willing to admit. And in that moment, I knew the diamond wasn't just a jewel. It was a key to what I wasn't sure yet. But we were about to find out. A shadow passed over Evelyn's delicate features, the lightness in her voice fading as she leaned forward. I want to wear it down there, she said, her tone now carrying an edge of finality. I glanced at Poirot, and a thought struck me. But surely the Yardley collection contains some very famous jewels, including a rather large diamond. Miss Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. That's true, she admitted curtly. From the corner of my eye, I saw Poirot's brows lift slightly. He murmured something in French too low for me to catch, before speaking aloud, his voice laced with that peculiar, almost supernatural intuition of his. Then you must already be acquainted with Lady Redgrave, or perhaps your husband is. A flicker of something irritation, caution, passed through Evelyn's eyes before she composed herself. Gregory knew her when she was in California, 3 years ago, she answered, her tone deceptively casual, but there was hesitation there, a beat too long before she added, almost abruptly, do either of you ever read Society Gazette? Poirot and I exchanged guilty glances. There was no use pretending. We had both indulged in its pages more often than we cared to admit. Miss Evelyn didn't wait for our answer. She reached for a copy of the newspaper lying on the table, flipping swiftly through its pages. This week's issue has something interesting, she muttered, stopping at a specific article. Her fingers traced the headline before she began to read aloud. Among the world's most famous jewels is the fabled Star of the East, an exquisite diamond in the possession of the Redgrave family. Brought from China generations ago, legend claims the stone once served as the right eye of a temple god, stolen from an ancient shrine. Superstition whispers of a curse, an eternal warning that both of the god's eyes must be returned, or disaster will follow. She paused, her fingers tightening on the paper's edges. Silence filled the room. The words hung between us, heavy and unspoken, a jewel torn from a god's face, a supposed curse, a matching stone now in Evelyn's possession. A cold sense of foreboding prickled at the back of my neck. I turned to Poirot, expecting some expression of skepticism, but his sharp eyes were locked onto Miss Evelyn's face, reading every flicker of emotion with unnerving precision, and for the first time I realized, she wasn't just concerned about a robbery, she was afraid of something far worse, something she hadn't told us yet. Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper as she read the final lines of the article. It is a curious coincidence that a stone bearing a striking resemblance to the Star of the East is currently in possession of the renowned film actress Evelyn Harcourt. Dubbed the Western Star, this diamond is said to be of equal brilliance, making one wonder, could these two legendary jewels be the long-lost twins of myth? And if so, what fate awaits them when they are finally reunited? The room seemed to tighten around us. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the words pressing down. Poirot, however, merely tilted his head, his sharp gaze fixed on Evelyn. And you, madame, he murmured, do you not fear the legend, that reuniting these so-called Siamese twins will summon a spectre from the past, a guardian perhaps, a vengeful god come to reclaim what was stolen? His voice was light, but there was an undercurrent beneath it, something knowing. Evelyn let out a soft laugh, though there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. I don't believe in old stories, Monsieur Poirot, and frankly, I doubt Lady Redgrave's diamond is anywhere near the quality of mine. She leaned back, her delicate fingers brushing the chain around her neck. Still, I intend to see for myself. Poirot opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door swung open with force. A man strode in, tall, broad-shouldered, the very image of a leading man stepping off the silver screen. His black curls were tousled in an artful way, and his confident smirk held just enough arrogance to be charming. His dark eyes scanned the room before settling on Evelyn. I said I'd come fetch you, he announced. His voice was rich, smooth. And here I am, Gregory Langford, the star, the icon, and more importantly, Evelyn's husband. He turned to Poirot, flashing a dazzling grin. So tell me, detective, do we have a case of grand larceny on our hands, or is this all just an elaborate fairy tale? Poirot smiled, polite, unreadable. That, monsieur, he said softly, remains to be seen. Gregory Langford and Evelyn Harcourt made a striking contrast, him towering with a confident ease, and her petite but burning with an unspoken defiance. Hoax or not, Mr. Langford, Poirot said, his voice measured, I have strongly advised Madame your wife against taking the diamond to Ashford Manor this Friday. Gregory sighed, shaking his head. And I couldn't agree more, sir. I've already told Evelyn the same thing. But you know how it is. She's a woman through and through. The idea of someone else, especially her, wearing a more impressive jewel, unthinkable. Evelyn stiffened, her fingers tightening around the chain at her neck. What nonsense, Gregory, she snapped. But despite her words, a flush crept up her cheeks. Poirot's lips twitched, but he simply shrugged. Madame, I have advised. I can do no more. C'est fini. With a polite bow, he saw them out, then returned, shaking his head. Ah, la jalousie des femmes. The good husband, he speaks the truth, but mon Dieu, no tact, not an ounce. I chuckled, but then hesitated. A memory stirred, fragments of gossip, rumors whispered at parties. Poirot, something about Ashford Manor and Evelyn. It rings a bell. His sharp eyes gleamed. Oui, mon ami. I thought as much. There is something underneath all this, something curious. He reached for his hat. I must breathe the air. Wait here. I will not be long. I barely noticed when I drifted into a half-doze. The room was quiet. The city hummed a distant murmur, until a knock startled me awake. Mrs. Hargreaves, the landlady, peeped in. Begging your pardon, sir, but there's a lady to see Mr. Poirot. I told her he was out. But she insists on waiting, says she's come all the way from the country. I sat up, intrigued. Show her in, Mrs. Hargreaves. Perhaps I can be of help. The door opened, and as the woman stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. I knew her, and in that instant, I knew whatever mystery had begun. It had just deepened. Lady Eleanor Ashford's face was known too well in the circles of high society for me to mistake her. Please, Lady Ashford. Do have a seat, I said, gesturing towards the chair opposite me. Monsieur Poirot is out at the moment, but I expect him back shortly. She murmured her thanks, and sat with composed elegance, a striking contrast to Miss Evelyn Harcourt, where Evelyn was golden and vivacious. Lady Ashford was dark, statuesque, with a beauty that held both pride and something deeply melancholic. Her eyes, sharp as they were, could not hide the shadows that rested beneath them. A strange excitement stirred within me. Too often in Poirot's presence, I found myself overshadowed, reduced to an observer rather than an active participant. But now, I saw a chance to prove that I too possessed a sharp mind. I leaned forward, my voice low and deliberate. Lady Ashford, I said, I know why you're here. You've received blackmail letters about the diamond. She froze. For a moment her breath seemed to catch, and then color drained from her face entirely. Her voice faltered. You know? I allowed myself a small smile. Through a perfectly logical deduction, Miss Harcourt received anonymous warnings regarding her jewel, and given that you hold the twin stone, I paused for effect. It stands to reason that you have received threats as well. Lady Ashford stared at me, her fingers gripping the arm of the chair. I saw the hesitation, the silent battle playing out in her mind. Then slowly she exhaled. You're right, she whispered. I have. She reached into a bag, withdrew a letter, and placed it on the table between us. The envelope was unmarked, the paper crisp, but as I unfolded it, my stomach tightened. The message was short, but its meaning was unmistakable. The two stars must reunite. If you bring the stone to Ashford Manor, you will not leave with it. A chill crept over me. This was no mere coincidence. This was a warning. And someone unseen was waiting. You see how simple it is, I said, watching her closely. I am right then. You have received these strange messages too. For a moment Lady Eleanor hesitated. Her fingers curled slightly against the folds of her dress. Then, with a small knowing smile, she gave a slow nod. Yes, she admitted. I have. Left by hand? By a messenger? No, mine came by post. She hesitated again, then added, but there was something peculiar about them, something unsettling. I leaned in, intrigued. What do you mean? A scent, a fragrance clinging to the paper. It was faint, but unmistakable, sandalwood and something sharper. It reminded me of joss sticks, the kind burned in temples in the East. A strange sensation prickled at the back of my neck. Miss Harcourt also received letters, I told her. Hers were hand-delivered by a man of Asian descent, dressed all in black. He left no name, no explanation, just the warnings. Lady Eleanor's lips parted slightly, and the wording, almost identical to yours." She exhaled sharply and clasped her hands together. "Then it is connected. But what does it mean? Surely the idea of a secret society pursuing the diamonds is absurd." "Perhaps," I said slowly, "but consider the legend. 2 gems, linked by fate, one in the west, the other in the east. And now, after all these years, they are drawing together again. Maybe someone believes in the prophecy." She shivered slightly, then straightened, her expression growing resolute. "I destroyed the letters," she admitted. "At first I dismissed them as nonsense, a prank, but now," her voice trailed off. I frowned. "A pity, the postmarks might have told us something." She shook her head. "There was nothing unusual about them, but the scent lingers in my mind." We went over the facts again, tracing the pieces of the mystery, but no matter how we turned it, the answer remained elusive. Finally Lady Eleanor rose. "I don't believe I need to wait for Monsieur Poirot after all. You can explain everything to him, can't you?" She extended her hand with a graceful nod. "Of course, Lady Ashford," I said, shaking it lightly. She smiled faintly. "Mary Cavendish told me to seek out Monsieur Poirot. She said he has a way of seeing through the fog." With that she turned and swept from the room, leaving behind only a faint trace of perfume, sandalwood, delicate yet lingering, like a whisper from another world. When Poirot returned, I relished telling him the details of what had transpired in his absence. He listened intently, his sharp eyes missing nothing, but I could tell he was not entirely pleased. "You have done well, mon ami," he said at last. "But there is something here, something we do not yet see, and that, Hastings, is what troubles me most." A chill ran through me, because I had felt it too. Something unseen was moving in the shadows, and it was coming closer. I had the distinct impression that Poirot was just the tiniest bit irked. He masked it well, of course, with his usual air of self-importance, but I had come to recognize the signs. His fingers drumming a little too precisely on the table, the sharp appraising glances he threw my way. It was rather a habit of his to downplay my contributions, and I suspected he was mildly annoyed at having no grounds to correct me this time. I, for my part, was secretly pleased with myself. Though I took care not to let it show, I had no desire to ruffle his delicate pride. For all his peculiarities, I was deeply fond of my eccentric little friend. "Bien," he declared at last, his gaze distant, his mind already miles ahead. "The plot thickens." He gestured toward the bookshelf with a flourish. "Pass me that prurage, if you please, Hastings. On the top shelf, yes. Ah, mercy." Flipping through the thick volume with rapid precision, his lips moved silently over the names. Then he halted. "Voila, here we are. Lord Ashford, 10th Viscount, served in the colonial campaigns." He sniffed dismissively. "This tells us nothing of interest. Married in 1907 to the Honourable Eleanor Forsyth, daughter of the 3rd Baron Forsyth, 2 daughters, clubs, estates." His fingers drummed again. "Humph. But that is not what concerns me." He snapped the book shut, and gave me a satisfied look. "Tomorrow, mon ami, we meet Lord Ashford himself." I stared at him. "What? You wired him?" "But of course. But you said you were done with this case." He smiled slyly. "I am done with Miss Harcourt, since she refuses to heed my advice. But this Hastings, is no longer about a mere client. This is about the satisfaction of Hercule Poirot, and when a puzzle presents itself, set impossible that I should resist." I let out an incredulous laugh. "So you've summoned a nobleman from his countryside estate, just to satisfy your curiosity?" Poirot gave a small self-satisfied shrug. "He will not mind. A man in possession of a fortune and a title enjoys the drama of a crisis. And besides," he leaned forward, his voice suddenly quiet, edged with something I could not quite name, "I suspect, Hastings, that Lord Ashford already knows more than he has told." A slow chill spread through me at his words. "You think?" "I think," he said softly, "that before the sun sets tomorrow, this mystery will take a most unexpected turn. He won't be pleased." "Au contraire, mon ami," Poirot replied with a smirk, carefully straightening the cuff of his immaculately pressed sleeve. "If I succeed in preserving his family's treasured diamond, he ought to be very grateful indeed." Then you really believe it's in danger of being stolen? I asked, leaning forward in anticipation. Poirot's response was maddeningly casual. Mais oui, Hastings, it is not merely a possibility, it is an inevitability. I blinked. A certainty. But how can you be so sure? Poirot raised a finger, silencing me before I could press him further. Patience, mon ami. The mind must not be clouded with unnecessary details at this stage. Let us proceed methodically. He gestured toward the bookshelf behind me with a frown. And speaking of method, look at that Prerage. See how you have replaced him. Hastings, you wound me. I followed his gaze, sighing in exasperation. What now, Poirot? The tallest books belong on the top shelf, the slightly shorter ones beneath, and so forth. A simple principle of order, as I have told you many times before. Yes, I interrupted, hastily repositioning the volume before he could launch into a full lecture on the virtues of tidiness. A few hours later, Lord Ashford arrived. He was a large, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice, ruddy complexion, and an air of self-assured ease. He strode into the room with the confidence of a man who had spent years being obeyed without question. His presence was imposing, yet there was something undeniably amiable about him, an infectious sort of good-natured arrogance. Dashed odd business, this, he announced, as he dropped into a chair with a grunt. My wife's been receiving some blasted peculiar letters, and now I hear this American actress has had the same treatment. Can't make head or tail of it. Some lunatic with a grudge, I suppose. Poirot, without a word, produced a folded copy of Society Gossip and handed it to him. First, my lord, I would ask you, are the details printed in this article accurate? Lord Ashford frowned as he adjusted his monocle and began to read. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to growing irritation. By the time he reached the end, his face had darkened considerably. He tossed the paper onto the table with a snort of indignation. Utter rubbish, he declared, his voice rising. Damned nonsense, the lot of it. There's never been any romantic mystery about the diamond. It came from India, that's true, but all this talk of ancient Chinese gods and curses. Poppycock. Poirot tilted his head, regarding him with an almost amused expression. Nevertheless, my lord, the stone is known as the Star of the East. Lord Ashford's temper flared further. Well, what of it? He snapped. A name is just a name. Some fool probably thought it sounded grand. It doesn't mean a thing. Poirot merely smiled, his gaze flickering with the satisfaction of a man who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle. I watched the exchange with growing intrigue. There was something about Lord Ashford's reaction, too forceful, too dismissive. He was clearly rattled, and if I had learned anything from my time with Poirot, it was that people rarely reacted so strongly to meaningless things. Somewhere beneath all this bluster lay a secret, and I had the distinct feeling Poirot already knew precisely where to find it. What I would ask of you, my lord, Poirot said smoothly, folding his hands in front of him, is to place yourself entirely in my hands. If you do so unreservedly, I have great hopes of preventing a catastrophe. Lord Yardley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usual air of jovial self-assurance seemed to waver as he studied Poirot's impassive face. Then you really think there's something to all this? He asked gruffly. These wildcat letters and superstitious nonsense. Poirot did not blink. Will you do as I ask you? The peer let out a deep breath. Of course I will, but... Poirot cut him off briskly. Then permit me a few questions. He leaned forward slightly, fixing Lord Yardley with a gaze as sharp as a knife. This affair of Yardley Chase, is it, as you say, already settled between you and Mr. Rolfe? Lord Yardley hesitated, his ruddy complexion darkening. Oh, so he told you about it, did he? He gave a short, mirthless laugh. No, there's nothing settled yet. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more hesitant, as if he were unburdening himself of a weight he had carried too long. Might as well get the thing straight. I've made a damned fool of myself in more ways than one, Monsieur Poirot. I'm in over my head in debt, ridiculously so, but I want to put things right. You understand? I've got my children to think of. I want to set my affairs in order, to live at the old place, without this constant noose tightening around my neck. Poirot nodded, waiting. Gregory Rolfe, Lord Yardley continued, is offering me a fortune enough to clear my debts and put Yardley Chase back in order. I won't pretend I like the idea of the place being overrun with actors and cameras, but I may not have a choice." He exhaled sharply. Unless he stopped himself, as though he had said too much. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Unless," he murmured, "you have another card to play." Lord Yardley's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. Poirot's voice was soft, almost amused. "Permettez-moi to guess. You are considering selling the Star of the East." A flicker of something, reluctance, perhaps shame, crossed Lord Yardley's face. "That's it," he admitted. "The diamond has been in the family for generations, but it's not entailed. I could sell it, if I find the right buyer." His voice grew gruff again, as though trying to mask his unease. "Hofburg, that Hatton Garden dealer, is keeping an eye out for someone with deep enough pockets, but if he doesn't find one soon, then it's a washout." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "And dernier question, Milord Lady Yardley, which plan does she approve?" Lord Yardley let out a short humorless laugh. "Oh, she's bitterly against selling the jewel. You know what women are like, sentimental about the damned thing. She'd rather go through with the film deal than part with the diamond." "I comprehend," Poirot said, a glimmer of something unreadable in his expression. He sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, then suddenly rose with a crisp, decisive movement. "You will return to Yardley Chase at once, milord." Lord Yardley blinked. "Yes, I suppose so, but—" "Say no word of this to anyone," Poirot interrupted, his voice firm. "To anyone, you understand, but expect us there tonight." Lord Yardley hesitated only a moment before nodding, but as he turned to go, I could not help but notice the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders. He had come here looking for answers. Instead, he was leaving with more questions, and something told me that when we arrived at Yardley Chase that evening, the real mystery would only just be beginning. "We shall arrive shortly after 5. Lord Yardley hesitated. "All right, but I don't see ça n'a pas d'importance," Poirot interrupted with a kind yet firm smile. "You desire that I preserve your diamond, n'est-ce pas?" "Well, yes, but, then do as I say." The nobleman left the room, still looking as bewildered as a man who had wandered into a maze and could not find his way out. It was precisely 5:30 when we arrived at Yardley Chase, our car rolling up the long gravel drive to the stately home. The butler, an elderly man with an air of quiet dignity, led us into the vast oak-panelled hall, where a roaring fire crackled in the grand stone hearth. The scent of burning wood mingled with the faint aroma of polished mahogany, filling the space with an air of warmth and old-world elegance. And there by the fire was a scene of almost painterly perfection. Lady Yardley sat in a high-backed chair, her dark regal head bent over 2 golden-haired children who nestled against her, their innocent laughter filling the room like a melody. Lord Yardley stood nearby, his face uncharacteristically soft as he watched his wife and children, a rare smile playing at his lips. The butler cleared his throat. "Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings." Lady Yardley's head snapped up, her expression shifting from warmth to surprise. Lord Yardley turned quickly, his eyes darting to Poirot as if seeking silent instruction. The little Belgian detective, as always, was equal to the moment. "All my apologies for this unexpected intrusion," Poirot said smoothly. "It is merely that I continue my investigation into this affair concerning Miss Marvell. She is due to arrive on Friday, is she not? I take it upon myself to ensure that all is quite secure before then. A small precaution." Lady Yardley's expression relaxed slightly, though there was still a flicker of unease in her eyes. "I see," she murmured. Poirot inclined his head politely. "Also, if I may trouble you, madame, do you happen to recall the postmarks on the letters you received?" Lady Yardley frowned, then shook her head regretfully. "I'm afraid I don't. It was foolish of me, but I never imagined they were anything serious." Lord Yardley cleared his throat. "You'll stay the night, of course." Poirot lifted his hands in polite protest. "Oh, milord, I would not wish to impose. We have left our bags at the inn." "Nonsense." Lord Yardley had caught on quickly. "We'll send down for them. No trouble at all." Poirot allowed himself to be persuaded, settling down beside Lady Yardley, as he observed the children with undisguised delight. Before long he had completely charmed them, engaging in a lively game that soon dragged me into the merriment as well. The once stately hall was now filled with laughter as Poirot, with exaggerated theatricality, took on the role of a defeated adversary in their game of make-believe. At last, a stern-looking nurse appeared in the doorway, her disapproving gaze cutting through the laughter like a knife. The children groaned in protest, but obeyed reluctantly, their small hands waving goodbye as they were ushered away for the evening. Poirot straightened his tie, giving Lady Yardley a little bow. "Vous êtes une bonne mère, madame," he said gallantly. Lady Yardley ran a hand through her now slightly ruffled hair, her lips curving into a wistful smile. "I adore them," she said softly, but there was a catch in her voice, a tremor of something unspoken, something deeper, and in that moment, I saw it, just a flicker, a shadow in her expression, a sadness, a fear perhaps carefully hidden beneath the grace and composure of a noblewoman. Poirot saw it too, I knew he did, and just like that, the air in the grand hall seemed to shift. The game was over, the real mystery had begun, and they knew with reason. Poirot bowed again, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. Just then a deep resonant gong echoed through the hall, signaling the approach of dinner. We rose to retire to our rooms, but at that very moment, the butler stepped forward, a silver salver in his gloved hand, upon which rested a telegram. Lord Yardley took it with a brief nod of thanks, tearing it open with the casual impatience of a man accustomed to urgent matters. As his eyes scanned the lines, his posture changed, shoulders stiffening, fingers tightening over the thin paper. Then with a short exclamation, he turned to his wife, and silently handed her the telegram. A moment of silence passed, taut as a pulled string. Then he looked at Poirot. "Just a moment, Monsieur Poirot, you should see this. It concerns the diamond." Poirot took the telegram, but his eyes remained on Lord Yardley. "It's from Hofburg," Yardley continued, his voice laced with excitement. "He's found an interested party, an American. The man sails for the States tomorrow, and they're sending someone down tonight to inspect the stone. If this deal goes through," he broke off, exhaling sharply, as though afraid to jinx his fortune by speaking it aloud. Lady Yardley stood still, her fingers crumpling the telegram slightly. Her face was unreadable, but her voice, when it came, was low and tinged with something close to sorrow. "I wish you wouldn't sell it, George," she murmured. "It's been in the family for generations." She waited for a response, a reassurance, something. None came. Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Then with a slight shrug of her elegant shoulders, she turned away. "Well," she said lightly, "I suppose I must go and prepare for the grand display. After all, we must give the American his money's worth." There was a hint of irony in her voice, but Poirot said nothing, merely watching as she moved toward the door. Just as she reached it, she turned back with a wry smile. "It's a hideous piece, really," she added. "George has always promised to have the stones reset for me, but somehow, that's never happened." She was gone before her husband could reply. Half an hour later, we were assembled in the grand drawing room, the glow of the chandeliers, casting long golden reflections upon the polished floor. The great clock on the mantel chimed softly. It was already a few minutes past the dinner hour. Then from the dimly lit hallway, there came a whisper of silk against marble, a soft rustle. Lady Yardley appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, framed by the gilded edges of the entrance, an ethereal vision in white. The shimmering fabric of her gown clung to her slender frame, the sheen of pearls at her wrists catching the light like droplets of moonlight. But all eyes were drawn to the necklace. A torrent of fire spilled down her throat, the gemstones pulsing with an inner light, each facet catching and refracting the glow of the chandeliers. And yet for all its brilliance, the piece had an unsettling quality, as though the weight of its history pressed down upon it. With one hand, Lady Yardley touched the necklace lightly, almost absently. Then she smiled, a dazzling, effortless thing that did not quite reach her eyes. "Behold the sacrifice," she said playfully. The tension in the room had shifted. The earlier strain in her voice was gone, replaced by an almost mischievous energy. She strode forward, turning slightly. "Wait," she continued. "Let me turn on the great chandelier so you can truly feast your eyes on what must be the ugliest necklace in all of England." She reached for the switch, and then, a flicker. The light faltered. For the briefest moment, The diamonds around her throat seemed to dim, as if something unseen had cast a shadow over them. Poirot did not move, but I saw his eyes narrow. Somewhere deep within their depths, a spark of realization had just been lit. Lady Yardley's fingers brushed against the switch, and then, darkness, a rush of air, the door slammed shut with a force that sent a jolt through the room, and then, slicing through the blackness, came a sound that sent ice through our veins, a scream, long, piercing, a woman's scream. Maud. Lord Yardley's voice rang out, filled with raw terror. That was Maud's voice. What's happened? We lurched forward, colliding into furniture, into each other. Someone cursed under their breath, another fumbled for a match, but in those chaotic seconds, one thing was certain, something had gone terribly wrong. Finally the door yielded under our combined force, and there she was. Lady Yardley lay crumpled on the cold marble, her white gown a stark contrast against the gleaming floor. A vivid red mark marred the delicate column of her throat, right where the necklace had been, but it was gone. Poirot knelt swiftly beside her, fingers finding the pulse at her wrist. For a moment I thought she was gone, but then, her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted, a single breath, then, a whisper. The man in black, the side door, a shudder racked her fragile frame, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Lord Yardley swore viciously, shoving past us. I followed without hesitation, my own pulse hammering. The side door, an inconspicuous, rarely used entrance, just beyond the hall. We reached it in mere seconds, just in time to see something, a shadow, a figure. No, gone, but on the ground, there, a glint of fire in the dim corridor, the necklace. Relief surged through me. I lunged for it, my fingers closing over the familiar weight of gemstones, but as I lifted it, my breath caught in my throat. Something was wrong. There, where the star of the east should have gleamed, was nothing, a jagged empty space. The diamond, I whispered, barely able to form the words. It's gone. Lord Yardley's face twisted. That stone was all they wanted, and then I noticed something else. A scrap of fabric, fluttering near the door, caught in the faint draft of the open passage. I picked it up. The silk was smooth beneath my fingertips, the embroidery intricate, but there was no mistaking what it was. It had been torn from someone's clothing, a warning, a signature. I turned to Poirot, my voice barely more than a breath. They left this behind. He took the fragment from me, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. Then very softly, he spoke. This is not over. In his haste it must have caught in the door, I said, breathless with excitement. Come quickly. He can't have gotten far. But the night was a thick, impenetrable shroud. The towering trees of the estate cast long, twisted shadows under the dim glow of the moon. We searched through the hedges, down the gravel path, even towards the distant gate, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no movement. The thief had vanished. Frustrated, we returned to the house. Lord Yardley wasted no time in dispatching a footman to summon the police. Meanwhile, Lady Yardley, supported by Poirot, had regained enough composure to recount her ordeal. I had just reached for the switch, she murmured, her fingers trembling as she touched her throat where the necklace had once rested. And then he was on me, from behind. I never heard him approach. Her breath hitched as the memory took hold. He wrenched the necklace from my neck with such force that I fell forward, striking the floor. Just before everything went dark, I caught a glimpse of him escaping through the side door, and then I saw it. She hesitated. Poirot leaned in. What did you see, madame? Her voice dropped to a whisper. The robe, the embroidery, the hair twisted in a long braid. He was, she shuddered, a Chinaman. The room fell into silence. A flickering unease settled over us. Then the butler appeared at the door, clearing his throat. He leaned toward Lord Yardley and murmured, "A gentleman from Mr. Hofburg's, my lord. He says you expected him." Lord Yardley started, momentarily forgetting his distress. Good God, I had completely forgotten. He ran a hand through his hair. I suppose I must see him. Not here, Mullings. Take him to the library. As he hurried away, I turned to Poirot. Look here, my dear fellow, wouldn't it be best if we returned to London? Poirot raised an eyebrow. You think so, Hastings? Why? Well, I hesitated. To be frank, things haven't exactly gone smoothly, have they? You assured Lord Yardley that all would be well, and now the diamond is gone, right from under our noses. Poirot winced, his normally unshakable confidence visibly dimmed. True, mon ami, it was not, how shall we say, one of my most brilliant successes. I almost laughed at his choice of words, but pressed on. So, having, if you'll pardon my expression, rather botched things, wouldn't it be wiser, and perhaps more dignified, to leave at once? Poirot gasped, and abandon the dinner, the exquisite, no doubt flawless dinner, prepared by Lord Yardley's chef. I groaned. Oh, what's dinner at a time like this? His hands shot up in sheer horror. Mon Dieu, it is true what they say about the English. You treat affairs gastronomic with a criminal indifference. There's another reason we need to get back to London immediately, I said, lowering my voice. Poirot, still distracted, merely tilted his head. And what is that, mon ami? The other diamond. His expression remained unchanged. Miss Marvell's. Yes. Don't you see? I leaned in, frustration bubbling beneath my words. They have one. Now they'll come for the other. For a brief moment, Poirot simply stared at me. Then suddenly his eyes widened, and he took a step back, nodding in admiration. Mais oui, your brain, Hastings. It marches to a marvel, and to think, for a moment, I had not considered this. Exactly, I exclaimed. We must act now, before it's too late. But just as quickly as his excitement had flared, Poirot's usual composure returned. Calm yourself, mon ami. There is still time. The full moon. It is not until Friday. I frowned. His insistence on this peculiar moon theory was maddening. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. The sense of urgency clawed at me. Forget the moon, Poirot. The thieves won't wait for it. They'll strike when the opportunity arises. To my relief, he finally relented. Without further delay, we left Yardley Chase, leaving behind a hastily written note of explanation for Lord Yardley. My plan was simple: go straight to the Magnificent, and warn Miss Marvell of the danger. But Poirot, ever frustrating in his unpredictability, refused. The morning will be soon enough, he insisted. Reluctantly I gave in. By dawn, however, I could tell something was amiss. Poirot, normally meticulous and energetic in his investigations, was oddly reluctant to act. He lingered in the apartment, reading the newspapers and fussing over his morning chocolate. Poirot, I said at last, exasperated. What are we waiting for? My friend, he said patiently, the newspapers have already reported the theft at Yardley Chase. The Rolfs will know as much as we can tell them. There is no need to rush. His logic was sound, but something about his lack of urgency unsettled me. My instincts told me we should have gone immediately. Then at exactly 2 o'clock, the telephone rang. Poirot answered, listening intently. His expression flickered, something between dismay and quiet excitement. Bien Serai, he said, before setting the receiver down. He turned to me slowly, his expression unreadable. Well, mon ami, what do you think? I straightened. What is it? Poirot exhaled. Miss Marvell's diamond. It has been stolen. The words hit me like a blow. What? I shot up from my chair. And what about your full moon theory now? Poirot did not meet my gaze. His hands, usually so steady, smoothed his immaculate cuffs as he murmured, It seems, Hastings, that you were, how do you say, right. But there was something else, something flickering behind those sharp, calculating eyes, and that's when I knew Poirot had missed something. And now so had we. They say appearances can be deceptive, but in this case it appears they were used to perfection. As we raced through the streets of London in a taxi bound for the Magnificent, my mind worked furiously to piece together the scheme. That full moon's trick was clever, brilliant even, I muttered. It was never about superstition. The whole point was to make us fixate on Friday, lulling us into a false sense of security beforehand. While we were looking ahead, the thief struck when we least expected it. It's a shame you didn't see through it sooner. Poirot, who had momentarily appeared disheartened, now sat back with an air of regained confidence. Ah, mon ami, he said, with a dramatic wave of his hand. One cannot predict everything. Even the greatest minds must sometimes be, how do you say, taken by surprise. I almost felt sorry for him. Despite his bravado, Poirot detested failure of any kind. Cheer up, I said, attempting consolation. We'll do better next time. Upon arrival at the Magnificent, we were immediately escorted into the manager's office. Inside, we found Gregory Rolfe, his face tight with frustration, seated opposite two serious-looking Scotland Yard officers. Across from them a pale-faced hotel clerk fidgeted nervously. Rolfe nodded in greeting, but wasted no time with pleasantries. We're closing in on the truth, he said grimly, but it's downright incredible, the nerve this guy had. I can hardly believe it myself. It took only a few minutes for the chilling details to emerge. Rolfe had left the hotel at precisely 11:15. Then at 11:30, a man entered. A man who, by all appearances, was Gregory Rolfe himself. Without hesitation, he approached the hotel's security counter, requesting his jewel case from the safe deposit box. He signed the receipt with casual ease, even making an offhand remark. Looks a little different from my usual signature, but I hurt my hand getting out of a taxi. The clerk, seeing no reason for doubt, simply chuckled. Not much of a difference, sir, Rolfe or the impostor laughed. Well, at least don't mistake me for a crook, all right. Been getting some nasty threats from a Chinaman lately, and the worst of it is, people say I look a bit oriental myself. Something about the eyes. I looked at him, the clerk now recounted, his voice uncertain, and I saw exactly what he meant. The way his eyes slanted at the corners, it was subtle, but noticeable. I'd never realized it before. The real Gregory Rolfe surged forward in his chair, his voice sharp with fury. And do you see it now? The clerk looked up at him. He paled. He swallowed. No, sir, he admitted shakily. I can't say that I do. And indeed, as we observed Rolfe's sharp, clear brown eyes, there was not a single trace of the so-called Oriental feature the thief had so boldly pointed out. The Scotland Yard officer let out a low grunt. That's a clever one. Knew the eyes might be noticed, so he pointed them out first, disarmed suspicion before it could even arise. He must have been watching you, Mr. Rolfe, waited until you were well clear of the hotel before making his move. What about the jewel case? I asked. The officer's expression darkened. It was found abandoned in one of the hotel corridors. Empty. Not quite. He exhaled slowly. Only one thing was missing. I didn't have to ask what. The Western Star was gone. We stared at each other in stunned silence. The whole affair was so bizarre, so utterly unreal, that for a moment, none of us could find the words. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Poirot hopped to his feet, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. I have not been of much use, I fear, he said with uncharacteristic regret. But if it is permitted, I would very much like to speak with Madame. Rolfe hesitated, his face tight with frustration. She's completely shattered by the shock, he said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Poirot gave a small nod, as if this was expected. Then, perhaps, a few words alone with you, monsieur. Rolfe's eyes narrowed slightly, but after a brief pause, he gave a curt nod. Of course, he led Poirot into an adjoining room, and I was left to ponder the sheer audacity of the crime. It was not merely a theft, it was a performance, staged to perfection. A man disguised so well he could fool even those who knew the victim personally, had walked into the hotel, stolen the diamond, and vanished without a trace. But what was the true motive? Poirot reappeared in less than 5 minutes, his face positively alight with excitement. He clapped his hands together, his earlier regret seemingly gone. Now, my friend, he said gaily, we must make haste, to the post office. There is a telegram that must be sent immediately. To whom? I asked, bewildered. Lord Yardley. I opened my mouth to demand an explanation, but Poirot silenced me with a mischievous glint in his eye. No, no, mon ami, you must not interrogate me just yet. I know you are disappointed with how this miserable affair has unfolded. You feel I have failed. No? Perhaps you in my place would have done better. He chuckled, linking his arm through mine, and leading me away. Come, let us have lunch and forget my supposed disgrace, eh? I was unconvinced, but I knew better than to argue when Poirot was in such a mood. It was well past 4 o'clock when we returned to Poirot's rooms. As we entered, a shadow rose from the chair by the window. It was Lord Yardley. His usually composed face was drawn and anxious, deep lines of worry etched into his forehead. "I got your wire and came at once," he said, his voice tight. "I've just been to Hofburg's. They know nothing about that agent who came to see me last night. They never sent anyone. And the telegram. They didn't send that either." His expression darkened as realization set in. "Poirot, do you mean to tell me that?" Poirot held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "1,000 pardons, milord. The wire was from me, and the man, also mine." Lord Yardley's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You, but why? What on earth were you playing at?" "My dear lord," Poirot said smoothly, "I was merely bringing matters to a head." Lord Yardley groaned and ran a hand down his face. "Bringing matters to a head. My God, Poirot, and what, exactly, have you accomplished?" Poirot's eyes twinkled as he reached into his pocket, and with a flourish, produced a glittering object. Light danced along its flawless edges. "The Star of the East," Lord Yardley breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But I don't understand." "Ah, none?" Poirot said, tilting his head. "No matter, some things are better left unsaid. What is important is that your precious jewel is returned to you exactly as I promised." He handed the diamond over with a small bow. "You may convey to Lady Yardley my deepest respects and inform her that all is well once more." Lord Yardley took the diamond, as if it were made of glass, something fragile, something impossible. He looked at Poirot in bewilderment, as if seeing him for the first time. Poirot, ever the gentleman, guided him politely to the door. "What a beautiful day it is, milord." "No. The sun is shining, the birds are singing, London is quite charming, is it not?" He smiled warmly, and shut the door behind the still stunned nobleman. Then, turning to me, he began to gently rub his hands together, a sure sign that he was supremely pleased with himself. "Poirot," I said slowly, still struggling to wrap my mind around what had just happened, "am I losing my mind?" "No, mon ami," Poirot replied, suppressing a chuckle. "But as always you are standing in the middle of a thick fog." I exhaled sharply. "Then perhaps you would be so kind as to explain how you got the diamond." "From Mr. Rolfe." I blinked. "Rolfe? But of course." Poirot's eyes twinkled with mischief. "The threatening letters, the mysterious Chinaman, the article in Society Gossip, all of it, my friend, was a grand performance from the ingenious Mr. Rolfe." I frowned. "But the 2 identical diamonds? Nonsense." Poirot scoffed. "There were never 2 diamonds, there was only ever one, the same diamond, mon ami. Originally part of the Yardley collection, but for the past 3 years, it has been in the possession of Mr. Rolfe." "But then why steal it?" I asked, utterly perplexed. Poirot sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed by my lack of imagination. "For many reasons, my dear Hastings. To begin with, Lady Yardley was growing, shall we say, uneasy." I stared at him. "Lady Yardley, indeed." Poirot leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You comprehend, do you not, that while she was left alone in California, her dear husband was otherwise occupied?" He tapped his temple knowingly. "And Mr. Rolfe, handsome, charming, with an air of mystery, oh, he was a master of romance, Hastings. But beneath the charm, he was a businessman. He seduced Lady Yardley, and then he blackmailed her." I sat back, my mind racing to connect the pieces. "So she gave him the diamond." "Exactement, to keep his silence." Poirot's expression darkened. "But such men are never satisfied, he wanted more. And so he devised this elaborate scheme, setting the stage for a second theft, one that would erase all suspicion from him, while allowing him to cash in on the diamond's value twice." I whistled softly. "And you saw through it?" Poirot preened slightly. "But of course, the moment I laid eyes on him I knew. His little trick with the eyes. Ah, a stroke of genius, a bit of grease paint, a few well-placed words, to plant the idea in the clerk's mind, and voila, a perfect disguise. And yet in the end, you still got the diamond back," I said in awe. Poirot beamed. "Naturellement. Hastings, you must understand, the mind is like a lock. With the right key, it will always open, and with that he leaned back, utterly satisfied, as if the whole affair had been nothing more than an amusing puzzle. I, on the other hand, felt as though I had just survived a hurricane. I confronted her that night with the truth, and after a moment's hesitation, she broke down and confessed. She swore that she had only been careless, that she had never intended harm, and perhaps in some naive way, she believed that. But fear is a powerful thing, and Rolf had played his cards well. He possessed letters that, when twisted just so, painted a scandalous portrait, one that could ruin her, rip her away from her children, and bring shame upon her family name. Trapped in a web of manipulation, she had no choice. She had no money of her own, and the walls were closing in. So she had allowed Rolf to swap the real diamond for a flawless paste replica, hoping against hope that it would never be discovered. The timing of the Western Star affair struck me instantly. All had been proceeding smoothly. Lord Yardley, weary of past indiscretions, was finally settling down, leaving scandal behind. Then, like a shadow creeping in at twilight, came the looming threat of the diamond sale. The deception would be exposed. Panic gripped her, and she must have written to Rolf in desperation, pleading for his help. And help he did, but not in the way she expected. He wove a masterful scheme, a heist within a heist, a robbery to silence her, to keep her from confessing to her husband, a theft to claim the insurance money, £50,000, an enticing fortune, and most cunning of all, he would still keep the diamond, ensuring his power over her remained absolute. Then came my part in this intricate puzzle. The mere whisper of a diamond expert's arrival had sent shockwaves through the household. As I had anticipated, Lady Yardley took swift action. She staged a theft, desperate to cover her tracks. A performance, brilliant in its simplicity. The lights out, a door flung open, a shriek that sliced through the night. She had already ripped the diamond from its setting with pliers moments before. But we saw the necklace on her, you say. Ah, mon ami, a trick of the hand, the clever concealment of a missing stone. A silk thread placed in the door beforehand, mere child's play. The moment Rolf caught wind of the supposed burglary, he leaped into action, crafting his own elaborate deception, a drama in which he was the star. When I confronted him, I left nothing to chance. I spoke in absolutes. Lady Yardley had confessed everything, I claimed. I was acting on behalf of her husband. If the jewel was not returned at once, legal action would ensue. A few more choice fabrications, words designed to ensnare him in his own fear. He folded like a house of cards. The diamond, still in his possession, was surrendered without protest. But what of Mary Marvell, a woman who had, through no fault of her own, lost a priceless jewel? Bah, the world is a stage, and for her this was the performance of a lifetime, an unparalleled opportunity, a scandalous tale that would grace every newspaper. Fame is her true treasure, and she has gained more than she has lost. And the other woman, Lady Yardley, she is different, a mother first, a woman bound by duty. Her story is not one of selfish gain, but of desperate survival. Ah, but then there is you, mon ami. You think you have uncovered the whole truth, that you have been at the center of this mystery. But no, this entire affair, you were but a player on the stage, reacting to the script written by others. It was not she who told you of the letters, but rather you who revealed them to her. A slip, an unintentional clue that she grasped onto, using it to her advantage. Psychology, my dear friend, you see only what is placed before you, never the subtle mechanics beneath. Impossible, you protest, but I assure you, it is not. You rage, your pride wounded, declaring that I have made a fool of you. Perhaps I have, but did you not enjoy the chase, the thrill of the unknown? To spoil such an adventure too soon would have been a terrible crime. Yet now you are furious. You storm out, slamming the door, determined to teach me a lesson. I smile, watching you go. You will be back, because the truth, mon ami, is that you love this game as much as I do.